Yeah. So good morning, everybody. I hope you're all well and warm where you are this morning. As I say, it's snowing heavily here in Cork. I feel for the guy who's out there collecting the bins at the moment, and I'm quite happy to be sitting in a warm office for once. So welcome to APEM's first webinar on the services that we offer. Today we'll be talking about remote sensing applications for the water industry. You just want to move the slide, Dave. So this morning you're with myself, Elliot Taylor. I'm APEM's Divisional Director for our still fairly new office here in Ireland, based in Middleton in Cork. And I'm with David Campbell, who is my colleague, the Divisional Director for our Remote Sensing Division, who's based in Manchester in the UK. Next slide, Dave. Can I maybe just check that people can hear me okay? I don't know if you're able to unmute yourselves, but if maybe at least one person could just let us know that you're
loud and clear.
Wonderful, thank you, Peter.
Yep.
Good. Yeah, so APEM works across all of the industries: water, renewables, particularly offshore wind, marine and ports, construction, transport, power and utilities. And we also have a fairly unique offering in terms of the biolabs that we have as well. Next slide, Dave. Yeah, so we work from source to sea. We're really structured into technical divisions. So freshwater biology and physical aquatic, covering all aspects of the freshwater environment, terrestrial ecology, marine ecology, our biolabs, our field division where we do all of our practical work, our office here in Ireland, which is a geographical division, but where we're providing all of the services for the other divisions. And then, of course, our remote sensing division, which is what we're going to talk about this morning. So I'm going to hand over to David, who will take you through some information on our remote sensing. And what I'd ask is that if you have a question for him as you go along, maybe you can just pop it into the chat and I'll pick them up at the end in the question and answer session. And also we'll see if there's time to allow some questioning as we go. Sorry, I've just missed that last slide. So yeah, we're based across the UK with a new office down in Ireland. We have over 170 staff now and are rapidly recruiting. And we're currently flying for our remote sensing offering in Ireland from Chester in the UK. But we're also expanding that offering as well. So with that, over to you, Dave. And as I say, if anyone has any questions, please just pop them into the chat and we'll pick them up at the end.
Okay, thanks, Elliot. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview for some of our remote sensing services that's specific to the water industry. We work across all different sectors, as Elliot was saying, but there's a certain group of services that are really targeted and have been developed specifically for the water industry. That's kind of where we started with remote sensing in APEM, probably 12, 13, 14 years ago. We got into it for mapping river habitats, and it's kind of expanded to all sorts of different areas from there. And that's probably, the water industry is probably our chief offering for our kind of onshore capability of remote sensing. So it's quite specifically targeted around it. So I'm gonna take you through a bit of a snapshot of some of the different offerings and how remote sensing can be used. Some of them are kind of whole presentations in themselves, so there won't be time to go into them, but I'll try and kind of explain the overview. And obviously there's time for questions at the end if there's anything that comes to mind. So it's mainly I suppose the main overview is that what I'm presenting here is mainly captured from a manned airborne aircraft. So it's a survey modified aircraft, which essentially means that there's a survey port or a hatch that's through the hull of an aircraft, and the camera systems or the sensors are positioned over that, over that camera hatch. The aircraft is flown with a pilot and a camera operator, and we capture our data, bring that back to the offices and process it into some of the outputs that I'll show you. I'm going to be talking about ultra high resolution imagery, and we class ultra high resolution imagery of that around sort of 2 centimeters per pixel or higher. So if you kind of imagine the whole world made up of Lego bricks spaced that are 2 centimeters in size, that would give you a kind of an idea of the sort of detail that we're able to achieve. And I'll show you some examples of what a 2 centimeter image looks like. But that's the kind of detail that you would expect from a drone survey. But we're able to get that from a manned aircraft platform, so we're able to get that level of detail, but roll it out over very wide areas and very large areas. So that's what I suppose our unique offering is. Orthomosaics, essentially that means getting the images together and forming them into a map. We can do topographic modeling from that, turning it into height data. And I'll talk about catchment, pollution mapping, 3D reality modeling, touch on wildlife surveys. That's another offering that we do. Kind of asset inspection, then leakage, and we'll go through them kind of one by one. So first offering is leakage from the air, and this is something that we have done quite a lot of over the years. So pipes leak, and often water companies don't necessarily know where those leaks are coming from. There's all sorts of, there's a whole industry obviously developed around finding those leaks, and they're kind of from the very micro scale, kind of in pipe solutions, to much broader scales, and we fit in kind of mapping large areas from the air to provide kind of a series of targeted areas that we think are leaks that we can see from the air that can be followed up on the ground. And there's 2 different methods. There's a summer method and there's a winter method. So the summer method is using something called near infrared. So we capture imagery in the color spectrum, a normal color imagery, but we also capture data in the near infrared, which is a little bit beyond what the eye can see. And this is the example of a near infrared image that you've got on your screen. And the advantage of near infrared is that it's very sensitive to vegetation and how much chlorophyll is in the leaf and how vigorous the vegetation growth is. Where you get vigorous vegetation, you get really strong reds. And when you get a lack of vegetation or water stressed or an unhealthy vegetation, you get this kind of grey, green, washed out colour. So as you can see from the image, like some of the bushes, some of the trees are really bright red, but those areas of grass on those people's front lawns are mainly kind of washed out. And that's because this was taken in a dry spell in the middle of summer, which is kind of the key environmental requirement for targeting these types of surveys. So you do have to go during the right conditions. So when I say they're washed out, they're mostly kind of water stressed, apart from that kind of bright area there, where there was a leak, and that leak was causing the vegetation to grow more vigorously, more healthily, and that shows up very clearly in the near infrared. And then that dashed line is the buried pipe. So it's a fairly simple technique, but it's very effective of flying over a whole area along the pipe routes, georeferencing and orthomosaicing that imagery, and then searching along the pipe routes for these areas of interest. So some of them will be really clear like that one, some of them won't be so clear. So we grade them into categories of how confident we are that there's a leak going on there. We hand that over to the water company, and the water company send out their ground surveyors to test and verify whether it is a leak or whether it's something else. And the success rate of this is pretty high. So I'll show you an example of that shortly. So that's our summer method. Requires dry conditions in the summer, but when you do get those conditions, you go out with the aircraft, you can survey a lot in a short space of time. So kind of 100, 150 kilometers per day in some circumstances, linear route is perfectly possible with the aircraft. So our winter offering is using thermal. So obviously the ground's a lot wetter, and kind of looking at changes in vegetation isn't going to be quite as good in the winter. So we use a thermal camera instead. So this is an example of a thermal image. So the blues and the blacks represent colder, and then the oranges and the reds represent warmer. So same as before, we'd fly over a pipe route, capturing thermal data as we go. And this is an example of where you can actually see the pipe route in the thermal data. So that it's pointed out in the arrows there. So that kind of linear structure, that's a buried pipe route. This was actually a thermal effluent. So there was warm water running through that, and it was captured on a cold night. We often do thermal surveys at night. And that shows up really clearly. And but when you do get leaks, then you can see that as a kind of a hotspot. And you can also see the pooling of water through the thermal imagery, if there is pooling of water on the surface, or if that's just around the surface and it's causing any change in temperature. That's what you'll see. The thermal camera isn't seeing through the ground at all to something that's below. It's reading temperatures on the surface of the environment, but anything that transfers heat to the surface, as this pipe is doing, that'll result in a change of temperature at the surface, and that means we can see it. And it's really can pick up very subtle temperature differences. So 0.1 of a degree, it'll pick up, and we can adjust the scale of the image to try and focus in on the things that we want to see. Again, we'd go through the imagery, pick up the potential leaks, and show them to the water company. So here's an example of a summer leakage survey that we did. So we were doing about 127 kilometres of trunk lanes and another 274 of district metre area. It was did a couple of years ago, this one. It was in early August, if you remember the really nice summer that we had a couple of years ago, at least in some parts of the world anyway. And this was in the south of England, where it was particularly dry and warm. We captured this at 5 centimetre imagery, which there's always we can go higher, but there's always a trade-off between efficiency and how detailed you need the imagery. And for this, 5 centimetres was sufficient. And then we went through that process, processing the data and finding the leaks. So I'll just turn the map on its side just for presentation purposes. But of those areas, we found 35 what we call our priority one site. So features that we found in the landscape that we thought were pretty nailed on, that those were going to be leaks. And those are the red dots. And 19 of those, so the ones that were circled, were the ones that were investigated by the water company for kind of capacity reasons. They didn't go to all of them, but 19 of them were investigated. And out of those 19, 11 of them were confirmed as leaks and could be subsequently repaired. So that was seen as kind of a big success, because those were 11 leaks that weren't known about. They were perhaps in a lot of them were in rural areas that wouldn't have been flagged up by customers or been seen otherwise. So that was seen as a very high success rate. Obviously, it will throw up false positives as well, and that's part of the method, and that's why it's a method where we're targeting effort over a very wide area for the ground teams. One thing that we often do alongside our leakage surveys is find drinking troughs, because they're often unlicensed, and when a water company is looking at the kind of the water balance of a catchment, then some of that water is undoubtedly going to drinking troughs that they're not aware of, and so they might be misclassifying those as leaks. So finding where the drinking troughs are, comparing to that to where the licenses are, water companies find that useful in our experience. So, and particularly those drinking troughs that are illegal and leaking kind of compounds the problem. So, that is pretty easy to see, as hopefully you can see on the screen there, where the drinking troughs are, and where that's kind of spilling over to the side and pooling water around it. You can also see that. So that's leaks. Invasive species mapping. This is something that we've been asked to do from time to time. It requires us to go out in specific seasons. So often it's Himalayan balsam, Japanese knotweed, and pennywort, which I'll show you an example of in a minute. So you've got to go for this one in kind of the late summer, early autumn time when those invasive species are in flower. And you capture the data at very high resolution, and then you can start mapping the extent of those invasive species. So that's an example of Japanese knotweed that's next to our operational base in Harden Airfields, just outside Chester. This is pennywort. So we've been commissioned for the last 6 or 7 years to go on out on certain rivers in the Midlands in England for mapping pennywort. Shows up pretty clearly, and we go out during the autumn, sort of November time, to map the extent of pennywort, and then that's used as kind of feedback information to help target where the cutting needs to be done, but also tracking the extent of it and how the eradication of it's going year on year. Catchment work. This is something we do a lot of, and I've done a lot of over the years. So essentially, the kind of the driver behind catchment surveys is that there's problems at the extraction point in a catchment. High nutrients, high bacteria, high pesticides, or all of the above. And rather than throwing more and more treatment at it at the works, the way of thinking now is to try and do as much as you can within the catchment to try and remove the problem at source. So by the time it gets to the extraction point, there's less to deal with it. Obviously, that has huge benefits for ecology if you can look at it that way as well. So this is why we've been getting involved in a lot of catchment surveys to try and target where the source of pesticides, bacteria, nutrients are coming in within the catchment. And this was developed by us, this kind of stepwise process, probably about 6 or 7 years ago, and it's being used quite heavily now. And it's kind of a tiered approach that starts with satellite imagery and ends up with people out in the fields with dipping water samples. So there's what from the satellite perspective, what we want to know is, kind of firstly what the land use is, the proximity of the land use to the waterway and the slope, amongst other things, and soil type and other things come into play as well. And we can use that as a scoring matrix to classify the landscape into different land cover types and different land usage, and try and get an idea of which subcatchments are going to be probably the highest risk of nutrient or pesticide input. And there's usually a specific driver that we're asked to target, and so there's slightly different methods depending on what we're targeting. When we've got those subcatchments, then and also water quality information is brought into it from kind of whatever information is available in stream. But we'll use the satellite to target subcatchments, and then we'll fly those at high resolution with the aircraft. Sometimes we fly whole catchments, but from a kind of a cost perspective, we usually try and narrow that down a little bit first. And then we start going into the detail of those subcatchments and actually identifying bad farming practices, for example, or the actual sources within the fields that we can see, well, okay, these are going to be your problems. So this is an example of where we've done that on those subcatchments, and we've kind of graded the point sources of the diffuse pollution effectively. 1 being the most severe ones, and 3 being, there's a problem there as well. And there's usually a lot of them we've found, and each one of them, we have an image for, and an image that can be used to try and help rectify the problem. And it's all sorts of things. It's things like manure stockpiled next to the river, no buffer strips next to the river, you know, kind of erosion from farming tracts, cattle poaching, all those sorts of things that you can see really clearly. This was an example of an erosion gully that was dumping a huge amount of sediment into the river. That's an imagery that's turned into a 3D data set. I'll show you some 3D data sets shortly. So we find all these different point sources of the catchment problems, and then we can stop at that point, or we can go out and send field teams to those kind of grade 1 priority areas to bracket sample around them and quantify the degree of the problem. And we often go out during kind of wet weather conditions, those first flush wet weather conditions, so we can see the quantity of nutrients or pesticides, whatever's been putting in the river at that point. We do this on the coasts as well, so just a few examples of kind of things that we've kind of picked up in coastal diffuse pollution mapping in the past as well. This is a kind of 5 centimetre imagery. Okay, so that's catchments. Thermal maps of assets, something we've done quite a bit of as well. So this is a water treatment site. This is a near infrared image again. So you can see the difference between the reds and the greys. But I'll show you that in the thermal, then you can see how a water treatment site looks when we're looking at temperature. So the bright orange areas are the bright white areas are the warm areas, and you can see kind of the heat being lost from storage tanks, for example. And the primary method of us surveying these are for kind of efficiency of the water treatment assets, so where heat is being lost. But also, like those filter beds, you can see the bottom left one on that is quite a different temperature to all the others, and the manager for that one, you know, kind of got flagged up there. Okay, well, that was a problem. There's something wrong with the filter bed media there, and that was investigated. So there's other things that can be picked up with thermal imagery. But thermal imagery for assets in general for the water company, that's something that we offer. There's an example of an outflow from the final effluent from a treatment site, and just some of the detail that you can see of the, you know, some of the buried pipe work and some of the assets just in a little bit more detail. And coastal thermal plumes, that's something we're asked to do for long sea outfalls, to look at whether there's any leaks along long sea outfalls. This one was an effluent that was coming out from a power station. So the power station wanted to increase the effluent, and they had to build a discharge temperature model as part of that, in order to help validate that. Getting an idea of what the plume was doing with the existing one was useful to them. So we went out with the thermal imagery, and we went this is a coastal environment, so obviously you've got the influence of the tides going on there as well. So we flew this 4 times at kind of peak flood, peak ebb, and then slack water at high and low tide as well. Obviously the thermal plume in its direction and its form changes through that. If you were going out with a boat, kind of doing grid sampling, you would get probably a bit of a confused data set, because the tide's constantly moving. The aircraft flies over in, you know, a matter of seconds for an area like this, and gets a snapshot in time, so you can see the development of the plume and help validate the models as well. Misconnections, and looking at homes for misconnected pipes. That's something we've done a fair bit of. So often you've got in towns and cities, there's 2 different pipe networks that, as I'm sure a lot of people will know. You've got your water rain runoff clean pipe, and then your dirty pipe from washing machines, toilets, etc. Where those, and some of them are combined pipes, but where you've got the separated pipes, 2 different pipe networks, and you get a cross connection between the dirty water going into the clean pipe on people's buildings, and that's when there's a problem for the environment, because obviously that water is going straight into rivers. And often it's not usually toilets, it's usually washing machines and showers that, you know, kind of plumbers have come in and they've plumbed in a pipe to the nearest one they can see, and that might be a down pipe from actually that's going into the drain. So we can fly the whole of a town or a city in the vertical and in the oblique as well, and we get detailed imagery on the sides of buildings, and it's detailed enough to be able to identify what that rainfall gutter pipe is, and where you've got things coming under windows that are going into that pipe. And if they are, then that's likely to be a cross connection or a misconnection. So that is what we're after, that's what we're looking for, and we go around and map those and then give those over to the water company, again, to target which homes to go and visit, rather than them knowing that they've got a problem because they can see it. They can see, you know, kind of discharge from washing machines in the rivers, but they've got no idea where in the town or the city that's coming from. This gives us an actionable list of addresses that have probably got a misconnection to go and, you know, kind of follow up with the customers. You can also get an idea of kind of the sewer network as well, because you can see manhole covers as well, and that's something that can be added in as part of it. That's another example of a misconnection. So it's something coming out of the building and then going into the water pipe. And that's an example output. So that was across, you know, kind of 100,000 homes, and I think there was kind of 6,000 target areas. So about, you know, kind of 6% of the homes in this survey were kind of targeted as, were identified as there's going to be potentially a bit of a misconnection there, and that's apparently the running average of misconnections across, you know, kind of most towns and cities is about, you know, between 3 and 8%, something like that, and that can be followed up, and those customers can be contacted. It helps you avoid contact with customers that aren't a problem as well, when looking at misconnections. And then another area is topographic survey, which is generating height data of the landscape, and that can be captured through imagery, which is photogrammetry. So that's a series of overlapping images that can be turned into a 3D environment, or it can be done through LiDAR, and we have both capabilities at APEM. Either way, we're asked to generate topographic data for infrastructure surveys in the main from one form or another. So it might be kind of an expansion of a treatment site, where topographic data from a wider area is going to want to be known, or often it's for pipe routes, and that might be laying down new pipes or modifying pipe routes. And we're asked to come in usually at a very early stage of it, and that could be at the kind of assessment of which routes are going to be planned at an early stage. So obviously you'd want to get a detailed topographic assessment of 3 or 4 potential routes to find out which one's going to have the most obstacles in terms of, you know, which humps and bumps you might need to pump over, but also other kind of environmental obstacles. So we would capture imagery and topography at the same time, and the kind of the ecologists and the engineers can have a look at that and help decide which is going to be the optimal route to take. Then we're often asked at the kind of the pre-commencement of in kind of the environmental planning stage to go out as well, for ecology reasons. So if there's going to be a new pipe route, there'll have to be all sorts of on the ground ecological surveys, and targeting that ground effort using the aerial imagery has been seen as a really good way of doing that and advancing the program of the area. So there was an example of where we were asked to go out in February on a linear route to capture all the ponds along 50 kilometres, because the ecologists needed to know where to go and do their newt surveys, and the surveys had to be done by the end of May for newt season. So they really needed to have a quick turnaround of where on these 50-kilometre routes they need to go and do their surveys, and they didn't want to rely on ordnance survey mapping or lower resolution and old data from Google Earth, which is much lower resolution. So we were able to go out, capture that, turn around the data around quickly, and they were able to go and do that. Otherwise, it would have meant waiting a whole other year before they could do those surveys, which would have put the program back. So I'm going to come out of the presentation now and show you some 3D and 2D imagery just to kind of sort of bring it all together. So this, this is an example of a 2-centimeter image, so kind of how we see it. So I just wanted to show you that so you can get an idea of the level of detail that we're seeing to do all this sort of analysis. So this is a water treatment site. And I think that gives a kind of a pretty good feel for the level of detail that you're going to be able to see. Temporary fencing there, obviously all the pipe work that's going on. You can see the handrails along that walkway there. If I just zoom out over to a back garden setting, then you can see people's washing line. So hopefully that kind of gives you a feel for the level of detail. So if you'd be interested in getting this level of detail over wide areas, as I say, this is the sort of level of detail that you're probably going to achieve from a drone, but because we're doing it from an aircraft, surveying 50, 100 kilometers of route per day is really achievable. So it's a really good way of getting a lot of data very quickly. Just look at the size of these houses actually, just see if there's any misconnections. You can see a pipe there. Oh, there's something going into it there. Anyway, shows you that you can see those pipes, and that this is a slightly oblique image. We have a camera array by the way, so there's a vertical camera. There's also oblique cameras that kind of look left and right from the aircraft, so that's why we're getting that kind of oblique nature, which is what we need to develop some of the 3D models that I'll show you now, but also see at the sides of buildings for those misconnection surveys. So I'll show you next a 3D data set. So this is a 3D reality model. So this is generating topographic data from the imagery that's turned into a height model, and then the imagery is draped over that, and it's using the vertical and the oblique imagery to do that. And then this is hosted online. So but I'll put a link to this in the chat after I've finished, and then you can have a play about it yourself. Here's a treatment site. So this allows you to look at the environment in 3D and play about with it. So for all sorts of different purposes. And we can make measurements. So we can make measurements of the stockpile of excavated material, for example, or we can measure heights of features, and we can start looking around in the environment. So this is really useful for looking at as a kind of a virtual health and safety assessment. So for water company assets, we've done a series of these for one water company where we've done really detailed 3D data that's given over to people that are going out onto site for them to kind of do that kind of pre-site visit inspection of kind of, okay, well, that's not parked there, that's too steep to get a lorry up, etc., etc. And just as virtual site visits, you want to go and check something, measure something on site. Is this going to fit there? Have a look at it online and measure it, rather than sending a car out for someone to go and measure it in the field. This example kind of has got a lot of the catchment issues that I was talking about as well, which is a good one to see. So and the catchment reasons were why we were asked to survey this particular area. So I'll try and find a few of those. So here's an outfall. This wasn't known about by the water company. Shows you the level of detail that you can see. Something coming out of that, something that could be, you could do a bracket sample up and downstream from that. We thought that it might be coming from this breaker's yard up here. That pipe seems to be tracking back towards there. This was a really sensitive fish habitat area for salmonids, and I haven't talked about it on this one, but we can map fish habitats from the air as well, which is what we did on this. And there's two main stems of the river, but there's also this channel that's running between the two, and this was quite important for juvenile salmon habitat. And these were cattle fields up and downstream, north and south of the little river, and the cows should be crossing there on that cattle crossing point, but as you can see, it's broken, so they weren't crossing there, they were crossing down here and causing cattle poaching and erosion and sediment input, which was degrading the spawning gravels there. Obviously that's the kind of actionable point that you can see from the imagery, that you could go and approach that landowner and say, well, this is causing a problem. You can clearly see that this is an area that's caused by your damaged cattle crossing area there, and it's degrading habitat. It's also interesting to see all the kind of the field drains all around here as well. And then I'll just show you some of the buildings in 3D as well. They, just to give you an idea of what you can see, and you get a little bit of warping, as you can see from the 3D, but we have this all backed up with the still imagery. So if we're looking at misconnections, we can go and have a look in this, but we can also constantly refer back to the still imagery as we've seen before. So that's probably the main things that I want to show you. So some of those are presentations in themselves, and it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully that's given everyone an idea of what we can do. I will, I suppose, hand over the floor back to Elliot for picking up any questions that might have come through the chat, or open up the floor for kind of questions that might just come to people's mind now. If that's okay, Elliot.
Yeah, thanks very much, David. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat already. I've tried to answer one of them. I don't know if you want to add to it, but with invasive species, from Simon Hughes, with invasive species examples, are you able to identify and measure the extent of the specific target species? And I've said that we can get down to 2 centimetre resolution. So dependent on the species, we can identify at 2 species level. And yes, we can certainly measure the extent of the spread.
Yeah. I mean, the main ones that we've been tasked to do in the past have been Himalayan balsam, Japanese knotweed, and then floating pennywort. Because if you go out in the right, at the right time of year, you can see the flowers on there, and they're quite visible. But if there's something else specific that you would be able to see, that you think you'd be able to see from that level of detail from the image that I showed before, that 2 centimetre image, then it could be targeted. Everything's geo-referenced and geo-located, so kind of measuring the precise.
Something like a species of lemna, which is a floating duckweed, I think wouldn't be possible to identify as a species, but certainly the extent of the issue would be.
Yes, yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. And then the next one was from Ronan Kane. So regarding the coastal thermal plumes, can this approach be applied to validation of marine models being used to assess impacts of wastewater treatment plant discharges? So is there enough of a temperature differential between the wastewater discharge and the marine environment?
There is, and we've we've seen that temperature variation of long sea outfalls, and I think that example that I showed before showed, you know, an outfall into a river. It will depend on the extent, on the volume and the temperature difference. So whenever we're kind of looking at extent of thermal plumes, you kind of want as big a difference as you can between what's going in the surrounding environment. So if you think the final effluent's going to be at 12 degrees, for example, you know, you don't want to go out when the sea temperature is 12 degrees. You want to go out there probably in the middle of winter when it's sort of 4 or 5 degrees or something like that, and then you'll see it going in. Now the extent to which you can see that is dependent on what the mixing zone is and how wide that is. It's seeing temperature. So as soon as that effluent has mixed into the ambient temperature of the sea, then you won't see it anymore. So that example from the power station, that was a big warm effluent. So you could see that for quite an extent. With some of the long sea outfalls that have been put in that we've been looking to see if the diffusers at the end of the pipe are working or not. That's a very localized, you know, of 5-6 meters, something like that you're seeing the extent of the output, which is sufficient for that purpose. So so you can see it, but only to the extent before it's mixed to ambient.
Yeah. And then he goes on to say, are there other remote sensing techniques to assist with validation of marine models for the assessment of the impacts of wastewater treatment plants?
Just say that one again, sorry, Elliot.
Are there other remote sensing techniques to assist with the validation of marine models to assess wastewater treatment plant discharges?
Maybe I can elaborate on where I was coming from. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Go
ahead. Just so previously we've seen some flown surveys measuring chlorophyll using spectral imaging, but I guess what I was wondering is, have any of the techniques that that have been developed in recent years been applied to, say, like validating dispersion coefficients for a discharge to a marine environment, like effectively like your example there where you have the thermal plume? I mean, that's a great example because it's got probably a very large flow and possibly a 10-degree differential, but in the treatment plants, obviously the discharges are going to probably be less, certainly the plants in Ireland, and as you said, the temperature differential will be less again. So I'm wondering, are there other aerial or remote based measurements of parameters that are prevalent in wastewater that we could actually use to try and get like snapshots of the discharge plume that we could then qualitatively validate our models and maybe tune dispersion coefficients against? That's sort of where I'm coming from. So I'm open to anything in that sort of space, or that's what I'm interested in.
We've used kind of high resolution color imagery to kind of look at kind of color change, and you know, any kind of waste that you can see and the extent of that. We've not and the thermal, as I say, there's not been another method that we've used to make a direct measure of the extent of how far that goes. But what we have done in the marine environment is mapped all the other, you know, potential sources of pollution in the environment that are coming from, you know, from land practices, from farming practices, for example, that would feed into the marine model. And we did that for quite a wide area to help, you know, kind of help educate the model in terms of the quantity of, obviously, if you've got kind of failing bathing water directives, you know, you use all that other information to say, well, you know, there's X amount of material going in from the land. We know what's coming out from the final effluent, and to help validate what the constituent makeup of it. So I suppose we've done it at that angle rather than a direct measure of, you know, nutrients or something from the air, which is something that we've not done.
Okay. I mean, I'm just thinking on my feet, maybe you could do a combination of dye and aerial survey.
We've done dye tracing before, yeah. Yeah, that's been done in, hasn't been done in the marine environment, but it's been done in inshore docks. Yeah. And that works quite well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another question on, with the 2 centimeter optical data, do we have any experience in implementing machine learning to automate feature extraction?
We do, yes. So another service that I haven't talked about here is we do wildlife surveys that's mainly for offshore wind farms. So it's looking at birds and marine mammals as part of the environmental assessment for the licensing of those offshore wind farms, and that requires us to survey areas of the sea and identify bird populations from that, and that is quite a high volume of work. So machine learning as being used to pick out the targets essentially. It's not good enough yet to speciate those birds, which we do with ornithologists, but it is good enough to identify the birds. So machine learning works well for the catchment workflow. That's a semi-automated process where kind of the land cover bit of it is automated through automated image classification. But some of the individual features that are quite kind of varied and requires a level of interpretation that's carried out by our catchment experts who are used to seeing those sorts of things in the field, so we can interpret them. So it could potentially be done, but it's dependent on the volume of work that I suppose will be required. Yeah. And whether you put the investment into generating the machine learning until you get to a certain volume of work. So at the moment, picking out those features of bad farming practice, for example, that's done by the human eye.
And then I think you've answered it already in what you were saying, David, but what types of remote sensing are utilised for offshore wind assessment? So I think you were saying we can identify birds and marine megafauna.
Yeah. So that's a big service offering. The resolution is higher than 2 centimeters sometimes for that, sometimes 1.5 centimeters or even 1. And we survey on it's usually, if there's an area that's been earmarked for a new wind farm development, it's usually 24 months of surveys that will go out, kind of once per month, capture a subset of the area, identify all the birds and the marine mammals within that, and then the population estimates would be generated from that. So yeah, we are, without a doubt, the global leaders in that field. We survey kind of all over the British Isles for that, as well as a lot of work in America, Australia, and further afield as well.
And I think it's useful and important also to say that there's certainly in Ireland there's still a leaning towards visual surveys, but we feel that there are safety issues to do with the flight at which you have to fly for visual surveys, and also that there's no sort of record of the data that's being captured.
Yeah, it's for visual observers, which is your observers looking out the window and usually speaking into a dictaphone or noting down the birds that they see. They have to fly at, I don't know, it's from memory, it's something like 100 meters above the surface, which is pretty low, and it doesn't really give a lot of time for the pilot to do anything if you do have an engine issue or anything like that. So we took the view more than 10 years ago that we weren't going to do any of those surveys, and we would take it to a digital platform that would fly a much higher and safe altitude, and capture very high resolution imagery and do the data analysis that way. And there's also kind of significant advantages in terms of data robustness and being able to audit the data, because you've got the image and someone can come along and check it. You've got precise locations of each bird. You can measure the flight heights of those birds as well, and it's a lot more kind of data rich. So that's in a lot of areas in the world, that's now the preferred method.
Yeah. I think, and there are specific issues with marine masts, which are not on charts.
Yeah.
With another question from Peter Irvin, it says, does the LiDAR give ground levels through water? Can you map the bed of a lake or give substrate types? This isn't LiDAR, is it, David? But
well, you can do bathymetric LiDAR. Normal conventional LiDAR doesn't work underwater because you just get the laser. It's an active laser pulse that comes out from the aircraft, bounces off surfaces, and gives you a return of the height of the land. Normal LiDAR gets absorbed by water, so it won't punch through the water surface. There is bathymetric LiDAR kits available. We don't have one, but we do have access to them through our partners. They're pretty scarce because they're mainly used in for marine mapping of bathymetry in areas where there's very clear water, so around the Bahamas or something like that. The extent to which they work is dependent on the clarity of the water. So I think they will generally work to about one or 1.5 times the Secchi depth. So if you've got a reasonably clear lake, then yes, you could survey it with bathymetric LiDAR. What we usually do, it's quite expensive, bathymetric LiDAR, because those bits of kit is fairly new technology and it's fairly scarce. So unless you've got a very large project or you're mapping lots of water bodies all at the same time, it wouldn't make sense to go and capture that data with a bathymetric LiDAR. So what we do is we have a boat-based, sonar-based technique for looking at reservoirs, and that's, we've got a program of surveys that happen all the time for that. And that data, or those data, you can use the sonar returns to help map the substrate, and usually pair that with crab samples as well, to validate the returns that you're getting. And you can also see the sediment depth, by the way, because we have a dual echo sounder, so you get a return from the sediment surface, but also from the kind of the hard surface underneath. So if you've got kind of an accumulation of sediment that's since the reservoir or the lake was, from the reservoir was installed, then you would see that sediment build-up layer as well.
Okay. The next one is from Mark Redeker. Are there any brackets legal or I guess other restrictions to such aerial surveys? For example, sensitive areas or military areas, privacy demands that may restrict surveying. As someone who's just spent a year or so living in Rwanda, that would definitely have applied there. But is it something that we come up against?
So first thing to say is we have a right to take imagery in from airspace, and yes, they are very high resolution images. There's nothing illegal about what we're doing. We obviously want to treat, because of the resolution and the detail that we're getting, we want to treat that sensitively. So often when it involves imagery of people's back gardens, then if there's anything sensitive out there, then that can be removed from the data set. And yeah, you do sometimes get sunbathers on a hot sunny day, but that's just a case of obviously keeping a tight control on the data from a sensitivity point of view. There's nothing illegal about it. The restrictions in terms of where we can fly, there are restrictions in terms of airspace, so areas around airports, military firing zones, for example. It's very rare that we can't get into those areas. It's just that we have to talk to them about it, and they're obviously we don't want to go on a firing day if they're testing on a military site. So we liaise with them, and they let us into their airspace and it's usually on a weekend when they're not firing. So there's the only areas that we haven't been refused into is the area immediately on the approach to Heathrow Airport. I think everywhere else, including central parts of central London, and it's not, with enough negotiation, it's not a problem.
Thanks, David. We've got two last questions. I know we're up to the hour now, so we'll just make these quick ones. Or I guess, can groundwater data be combined with remotely sensed data, and in what areas would that be applicable?
So yeah, if we're doing those catchment surveys, and we're looking at a combination of kind of where water quality, then I suppose the aerial data would get the information from what's happening on the surface, and then if you've got groundwater data, that could be paired within a GIS. So yeah, everything's geolocated. So if you wanted to do some analysis, putting the two together, then that could be done within a GIS environment. Okay.
And then the last one was coming back to the bathymetric LiDAR. So what is its depth range in turbid areas, or it just doesn't work in turbid areas?
Well, if you've got like a turbid estuary, for example, where it's essentially won't work. It's Secchi. If you're putting your Secchi disc out,
yeah,
the point of where you can't see the disc anymore. That's so kind of that, or 1.5 times is probably the extent to which it will work. So yeah, it's entirely dependent. In a freshwater reservoir that's not got an algal bloom on it, it'll probably work. That's reasonably clear. It'll probably work to about 3-4 meters depth, something like that.
Okay, great. I used to work in the Norfolk Broads, and we would regularly get a Secchi depth of about 1 centimeter.
Yeah.
And I remember being at a conference. There was a guy presenting about Lake Tahoe in America, where their Secchi disc readings had dropped from 60 meters to 55, and he was complaining.
Wow. Well,
everything is relative.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why it's often used in. It's not widely used in the UK bathymetric LiDAR for that reason, but it is in certain locations, but mainly in a marine environment. Great,
thank you very much, David, and thank you everybody else for attending. I hope that you've found this useful. I think you have our contact details if you need to get in touch with us at all. So please do that. The next presentation that we will make, the next webinar that we will present, is April the 14th, where we're talking about macroscopic work to facilitate macroscopic projects. So that will be a look into the work of our biolabs. So thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.